Hello and welcome again to 10 Things About Writing. Today, by request, I'm going to talk about research. It's an important topic. Depending on the book that you're writing, you may have to do a lot of it, or you may not have to do any at all. You may be writing about your own personal experiences, writing what you know, in which case you may not need any research at all. But if you are writing about something that you don't know fully, whether it is factual or whether it's about a place that you don't know intimately or whether it's about a point of view that you don't know intimately, then you are going to have to do research. And in terms of making your book as authentic as possible, you don't want to be skimping on research because it's very easy to bring a book crashing down in flames if you get a detail wrong and somebody spots it, and it ruins the fiction for them. For instance, I still remember the Victorian detective series that I started reading and had to stop when the detective presses a 50p piece into the hands of the urchin, knowing exactly when 50p pieces were introduced. That was just a terrible, colossal failure of basic research and made those books unreadable for me after that. And it's not something that anybody does on purpose, but there are lots and lots of pitfalls when you're writing outside of your area, particularly if you think that actually it's a relatively familiar place. For instance, English people writing about America or Americans writing about England. We are separated by more than a common language. There are all kinds of details that need to be researched if you are going to do that. And it's not enough just having watched TV or feeling that you know New York because you've seen it in a lot of films. You actually need to know a great deal more than just the surface. Now, to me, there are three kinds of research. One is purely factual and is usually relatively easy. For instance, I wrote an awful lot of books that were thematically built around chocolate and chocolate making. And in fact, my research was relatively minimal for this because all I really needed to do was read up on chocolate making, visit a chocolate maker, and take my research and then use it in my story. I didn't use all the research that I did. Nobody should. Research isn't there to be included in its entirety in your work. What it's there for is to make you feel at home in the world that you're building. I needed to feel at home in the world of chocolate shops and chocolate making. And so I didn't spend hours and hours researching what chocolate tasted like and this kind of thing. Actually, I used a chocolate cookbook, which gave quite a lot of really interesting, useful details. And I went and talked to somebody who was making chocolate, who talked me through the basic procedure. And then I brought maybe a tenth of what I'd learnt into my book, just enough to give it the right flavour without bashing people on the head with all the new knowledge that I'd acquired about chocolate making. So factual research doesn't necessarily take a huge amount of time. You need to know the facts about certain things. Then there is research which is about world building, and that I think tends to be more time consuming and more tricky, because until you know what you need to know, you don't always know what you need to know. And this is where it becomes a bit of a challenge when you're writing outside of the world of your experience. This is where it's a challenge if you want to write a book set in New York and you've only ever seen New York through movies. And you've got a number of ways to go to do that research. But if you are talking about a real place, I don't think that there is much substitute for actually going there. I know that's not always possible. Sometimes it's absolutely impossible because you're writing about a place and a time. And obviously we don't get to go back in time. But if you do get the chance to go to the place you are writing about, it is extremely useful because there are all kinds of things you can learn without visiting a place. But there are certain essential, visceral things about being there, which it's very difficult for people to convey through writing or through looking things up on Google Maps or from watching documentaries about it. Sometimes to get to the heart of a place, you have to go there and enter it with no expectations, just absorb all the stimuli you can get until you get to the detailing, the small detailing, which is going to make your writing authentic. I know not everybody can afford to travel all over the place, in which case, if you find that you're not going to be able to enter the world you've chosen to write about, maybe put it on the back burner and write about something else for a while, because it is really a very important thing for you to be able to know the details. The next best thing is to talk to somebody who lives there or who has been there and has spent a long time. And they may be able to give you the details. For instance, if you're writing about the police force, that's a world too. It's not a geographical world, but it is a world in itself, a community. The best thing to do is to befriend a police officer and get them to give you the dirt on what goes on. Or if you want to write about being a teacher. Teaching, again, is a whole world of experience. If you haven't had that experience, there are certain things you won't know. And if you do talk to a teacher, and I was a teacher for many years, you will learn things that only teachers know and that they don't even think of, because they take these things for granted because they inhabit the world of teaching and you don't. And so to try to give the illusion to your audience that you and they inhabit a specific world of experience, then you need to know the little details that make all the difference. For instance, one of the things that I remember about teaching was that on windy days, school kids always misbehave. I don't know why, but it's one of those things. And if you talk to a teacher, they'll go, oh yeah, that's right. And non-teachers will not know this. Or if you're talking about geography, one of the things I learned about, because I wanted to write about Russia at one point, very briefly, just a passing reference about Moscow, and I'd never been. And I used something that a friend of mine who had lived in Moscow told me, and she said, one of the things about spring in Moscow is that when all the snow melts, all the dog shit rises to the surface, and after a while, you just have really nothing but dog shit for miles around. And I used this detail in one of my books. I think it was Chocolat, actually. And I got a letter from somebody who did live in Moscow, who had read this book in translation, and who said, my God, have you been to Moscow? How did you know this? And I thought, wow, that's great. The fact that somebody who knows Moscow recognized that detail as being authentic. This is great. This was a wonderful discovery for me, because I was just learning about research and how much research you have to do and how much you can leave behind you. And I thought, well, at least in that detail, I got something right. Now, I keep saying details, and I think it's because in many ways, people who do research books don't tend to think so much about the small details, but I think that the small details are in some ways more important than the big things. They are the things that if you get them wrong are likely to really make a difference between somebody properly entering your fiction and somebody feeling that they haven't quite been convinced. And this is why when you're researching stuff, you have to go deeper than just the surface. It's not enough just to look at films or look at brochures or look at pictures or, read about the background of something. You actually need to forensically go into the foreground and bring out the details that will make the difference, which will make your fiction seem real. And in some cases, that will mean talking to people with experience that you don't have. When I was writing 5 Quarters of the Orange, which was the experience of somebody who had known the Second World War, who had known the occupation in France, in the country, as a child, I needed to talk to people who had known that. I couldn't just invent it, because I wasn't writing a war story where I could check history books. I was writing a story of community with that historical background, that scenario around it, and I needed to know details, not where Hitler was at any specific date. Obviously those things are important if you're going to bring those historical events into your historical fiction. But otherwise, I needed more. I needed to know how people lived. I needed to know what foods were in short supply. I needed to know things about textiles and planting and the sort of thing that a community of that kind, a rural community in France during the occupation, would know. And so this is always something that you need to bear in mind. And how long it takes is how long it takes. You will know when you're in a position to say, I feel I can comfortably inhabit this world and depict it. Once I wrote a book about the film industry, and I abandoned it because, I didn't know enough about the film industry at the time. I still don't know enough about the film industry at the time, so the book is still abandoned. I don't think I'm ever going to be comfortable writing about that world. It was an experiment. It failed. It's fine to have experiments and failures, but obviously you don't want too many of those. And so bear this in mind when you're doing your research and when you're choosing worlds to inhabit in your fiction. And as always, enjoy it. Until next time.